Tonight, we're going to talk about an empire that had everything. More land than it could manage, more gold than it could count, more power than it could control. For a moment in history, Spain stood at the center of the world. And yet, this is not a story about success. It's a story about what happens when wealth arrives faster than wisdom. So, slow down, and let's watch the Spanish Empire do something very human. Let's watch it spend itself to death. Long before Spain ruled distant oceans, before gold crossed the seas, and before ships carried its flag across the world, Spain was a quiet land, made of many smaller kingdoms. It was a place shaped by mountains, rivers, and long, slow seasons. Castile, Aragon, Leon, Navarre, and Granada. Each kingdom lived by its own rhythm, its own customs, its own traditions. There was no single Spain yet, only neighboring lands sharing the same sun and the same soil. Life moved slowly here, very slowly. Most people rose with the first light of morning as the sun warmed the fields and softened the cold air. Farmers worked the land, planting wheat, tending olive trees, watching over sheep that grazed quietly on the hills. The seasons guided everything: when to plant, when to harvest, when to rest. In the villages, life was simple and familiar. Stone houses lined narrow streets. Dust rose gently beneath passing footsteps, and church bells marked the passing of time, morning, midday, and evening. News traveled slowly, sometimes taking weeks or months to reach distant towns. Most people never traveled far from home. Their world was small and deeply known. Markets gathered once or twice a week, where bread, wine, wool, and olive oil were exchanged. Voices remained soft, life remained steady, and change came gently. For centuries, power shifted quietly between kingdoms, sometimes through marriage, sometimes through agreement, sometimes through long periods of waiting. But there was no great rush, no global ambition, no distant vision yet. Spain was still inward-looking, focused on its land, its faith, and its daily survival. And yet, beneath this calm surface, something subtle was forming. Roads slowly improved, towns slowly grew, and rulers began to think beyond their borders, not with urgency, but with patience. For now, though, the world remained peaceful and predictable. The wind moved gently through olive trees. Rivers reflected the soft afternoon sun, and life continued as it had for generations, unaware that soon the horizon itself would begin to open. As the years passed, the quiet kingdoms of the Iberian Peninsula began to feel closer to one another, not through sudden change, but through patience and time. In the late 15th century, two figures emerged quietly at the center of this slow transformation: Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon. Their marriage in the year 1469 was not celebrated with great noise or immediate change. It was a careful union, a political bond between two powerful crowns. Castile remained Castile, Aragon remained Aragon, each with its own laws, its own traditions, its own customs. Yet now, They shared a single purpose and a common direction. Power did not rush forward. It gathered slowly, like water filling a wide basin. Rulers began to think in longer terms, beyond the next season, beyond the next harvest. The land grew more stable, roads became safer, communication more reliable. And in the year 1492, another chapter quietly closed. The city of Granada, the last Muslim kingdom on the peninsula, passed into Christian rule. This marked the end of centuries of gradual reconquest and the beginning of a more unified Spain. For the people, daily life changed very little. They still rose with the sun, worked the same fields, and returned home as evening fell. Bread was baked, wine was poured, candles were lit as night approached. But beneath this familiar rhythm, the foundations of a kingdom were becoming stronger. The monarchy gained authority, taxes became more organized, and decisions were made from a clearer center of power. Spain was learning how to govern itself before attempting to govern others. There was no sense yet of distant continents or endless oceans, only a quiet confidence growing slowly, year by year. The rulers believed that order brought strength and unity brought opportunity. For now, the land rested. Fields stretched calmly under open skies. Church bells echoed softly through valleys, and towns settled into peaceful routines. Spain had not yet stepped onto the world stage, but it was preparing, with patience and silence. The pieces were coming together, not with urgency, but with care. And somewhere beyond the horizon, unknown and unseen, the future waited. As Spain grew more stable, its attention slowly began to shift, not inward, but outward, beyond the fields, beyond the towns, beyond the familiar roads. In the late 15th century, the world felt larger and more distant. Trade routes to the east, once reliable, had become longer and more uncertain. Spices, silk, and precious goods traveled slowly across land, changing hands many times. Portugal had already turned toward the sea, sailing south along the African coast, searching for new paths to Asia. Spain watched, patiently. And then, a quiet proposal reached the royal court. A sailor named Christopher Columbus believed the world could be crossed by sailing west. His idea was uncertain, his calculations imperfect, yet his confidence remained steady. For years he waited, as rulers considered his request. Finally, with Spain newly united and seeking opportunity, the crown agreed. In the year 1492, 3 small ships prepared to depart. They were not large nor grand, but they were carefully supplied. Sailors gathered at the harbor, checking ropes, folding sails, and watching the tide. As the ships left shore, Spain faded slowly behind them. The coastline grew smaller until it became only a memory. Days passed, then weeks. The ocean stretched endlessly, calm at times, restless at others. Sailors watched the sky, measured the stars, and listened to the wind. At night, the sea reflected moonlight, and the ships drifted quietly forward. There was no certainty, only movement and patience. Then, after long days at sea, the horizon changed. Land appeared, slowly, gently. Islands rose from the water, covered in green, bathed in sunlight. Spain had reached something new, though it did not yet understand what it had found. For now, the ships rested, the waves softened, and the ocean grew calm once more. The journey had opened a door, not with noise, but with quiet wonder. And beyond these first shores, the world waited, vast and unknown. The ships did not return immediately, and when they did, their stories traveled slowly. News crossed the ocean only as fast as the wind would allow. When word finally reached Spain, it spoke of new lands, far beyond the known maps. Not cities of gold, not yet, but islands, warm air, and unfamiliar shores. The first lands encountered lay in the Caribbean, where the sea was calm, and the sun rose gently each morning. Palm trees moved softly in the breeze, and forests stretched quietly inland. Spain listened, carefully. More voyages followed, each one slow, each one uncertain. Sailors returned with descriptions of rivers, mountains, and people who lived by rhythms older than Europe itself. At first, these lands felt distant, almost unreal. They existed somewhere beyond the horizon, separated by months of travel. Spain began to organize its presence, not quickly, but methodically. Small settlements were founded, harbors were mapped, and supply routes were established. Messages took months to travel between the New World and the royal court. Decisions were delayed, and authority moved slowly. For the people of Spain, daily life continued unchanged. Farmers still worked the fields, markets still opened at dawn, and church bells still marked the hours. Few could imagine the scale of the lands now connected to the crown. Yet with each passing year, Spain's awareness of the world expanded. The oceans no longer felt like borders, but pathways. Pathways that linked continents, cultures, and distant futures. The New World remained quiet, vast, and only partially understood. For now it rested beyond the sea, waiting, as Spain slowly learned what it meant to be part of something larger. As the years passed, Spain began to move beyond observation. The distant lands across the ocean were no longer only stories carried by sailors. They became places of intention, places where the crown would act. The early voyages had revealed coastlines, islands, and unfamiliar peoples. Now, Spain sought something more lasting: control. Not through speed, but through presence. Men were sent not only to explore, but to remain, to claim land in the name of the crown, to build towns, raise banners, and speak Spanish words into unfamiliar air. These men would come to be known as conquistadors. They were not kings, nor generals of great armies. Most were minor nobles, soldiers, or adventurers seeking purpose, status, or reward. One of them would soon change the course of history. His name was Hernán Cortés. In the year 1519, Cortés arrived on the coast of what is now Mexico. Before him lay the powerful Aztec Empire, centered around the great city of Tenochtitlan. It was a city unlike anything Europeans had seen. Built on a lake, connected by causeways, filled with markets, temples, and canals. The Aztec world was ordered, complex, and deeply rooted in ritual and belief. Cortés did not march alone. He relied heavily on alliances with indigenous peoples who lived under Aztec rule and resented its demands. These alliances were crucial. The Spanish were few in number. Without local support, they could not have advanced. Another unseen force also traveled with them. Diseases carried unknowingly from Europe spread through the population. These illnesses weakened communities, disrupting societies that had no immunity to them. Over time, through a combination of alliances, conflict, and collapse from disease, Tenochtitlan fell in 1521. The Aztec Empire was dismantled. In its place, Spain began to build a new colonial order. Not long after, another conquest unfolded far to the south. In the Andes Mountains, the Inca Empire stretched across vast terrain, connected by roads and messengers, governed from the city of Cusco. In 1532, a Spanish expedition led by Francisco Pizarro arrived during a moment of internal conflict. The Inca world was already strained by a recent civil war between rival heirs to the throne. Again, the Spanish were few. Again, they relied on timing, alliances, and the shock of unfamiliar weapons and tactics. The capture of the Inca ruler Atahualpa marked a turning point. Within a short span of years, the Inca state collapsed. By the mid-16th century, Spain now controlled vast territories from Mexico to Peru. The age of conquest was giving way to the age of rule. Spain now faced a new challenge. How does one govern lands an ocean away? The answer came slowly. The crown established large administrative regions called viceroyalties. The Viceroyalty of New Spain governed much of North and Central America. The Viceroyalty of Peru oversaw much of South America. Viceroys ruled in the king's name, sending reports back across the sea. To organize labor and resources, Spain introduced the encomienda system. Under this system, Spanish settlers were granted control over land and the labor of indigenous communities, in exchange for protection and religious instruction. In practice, this system often led to hardship and exploitation. Debates began to rise within Spain itself. Clergymen and scholars questioned the treatment of indigenous peoples. Figures like Bartolomé de las Casas argued that these populations were human beings with rights, not resources to be consumed. The empire was expanding, but its conscience was beginning to stir. By the middle of the 16th century, Spain was no longer simply discovering the world. It was reshaping it. Cities rose where empires once stood. Spanish law, language, and faith spread slowly through the Americas. Churches were built, missions established, roads extended inland. Yet control remained imperfect. Distances were vast. Communication was slow. Local realities often differed from royal intentions. Spain had gained an empire, but governing it would prove far more complex than conquering it. For now, the empire rested in a fragile balance. Power had been claimed, authority declared. But beneath the surface, new challenges were already forming. Challenges of wealth, of responsibility, and of an empire growing larger than it could easily hold. The winds continued to cross the Atlantic. Ships moved slowly between worlds, and Spain, now a ruler of continents, prepared to enter its most powerful and most complicated age. As Spain's control over the Americas solidified, a quiet river of wealth began to flow across the ocean. It did not arrive all at once. It arrived slowly, ship by ship, crate by crate. Silver from the mountains of Mexico, silver from the deep mines of Potosí high in the Andes. This silver would come to shape not only Spain, but the entire world. In the mid-16th century, Spain discovered that the lands it now ruled contained some of the richest silver deposits ever known. At Potosí, Miners carved deep into the mountain, day after day, year after year. The mountain itself seemed endless. Silver was refined, stamped into coins, and loaded onto mule trains that wound slowly toward the coast. From there, it crossed the Atlantic in heavily guarded treasure fleets. The ocean routes were dangerous. Storms, pirates, and long voyages made each journey uncertain. Yet, year after year, the ships arrived. Spain was becoming the wealthiest empire Europe had ever seen. Gold and silver reshaped Spain's place in the world. Coins bearing the royal seal circulated across Europe. Spanish silver reached markets in Italy, the Ottoman Empire, and even as far as China. Spain's currency became the backbone of global trade. For a moment, it seemed as though wealth itself had chosen Spain as its home. Kings financed wars, palaces expanded, armies marched under banners paid for with New World silver. But wealth, when it arrives too quickly, changes behavior. Spain began to rely not on production, but on extraction. Rather than building industries, Spain imported goods from other European powers. Textiles from the Low Countries, weapons from Italy, luxury items from France. Silver flowed out almost as fast as it arrived. The empire looked rich, but much of its wealth was passing through its fingers. Inside Spain, prices began to rise. This phenomenon, now known as the price revolution, swept through Europe. As more silver entered circulation, money lost value. Bread cost more, rent increased. Daily life became harder for ordinary people. Farmers and workers felt the pressure first. The empire was wealthy, but its people were not always prosperous. At the royal court, the solution seemed simple. More silver, more shipments, more extraction. Spain had discovered a powerful engine, but it had not yet learned how to control it. The labor that fueled this wealth came at a heavy cost. Indigenous communities were forced into mining systems such as the mita, a labor draft adapted from earlier Inca practices. Men left their villages for months at a time to work in dangerous conditions. Over time, population declines deepened due to disease, exhaustion, and displacement. To meet labor demands, Spain increasingly turned to enslaved Africans, especially in plantations and mines across the Caribbean and the Americas. This system tied Spain into the growing Atlantic slave trade. The empire's wealth was now inseparable from human suffering. These realities were not hidden. They were debated. Priests, scholars, and officials argued over morality, law, and responsibility. Yet the silver kept coming, and so the system continued. By the late 16th century, Spain stood at the center of a global network. Ships crossed the Atlantic. Others crossed the Pacific between the Americas and Asia, linking silver to Chinese markets. The world was becoming connected in ways never seen before, and Spain sat at the crossroads. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Dependence on silver made the empire fragile. When shipments were delayed or lost at sea, the consequences rippled through the economy. Spain was powerful, but it was also vulnerable. The empire had learned how to conquer land. It had not yet learned how to sustain prosperity. As night fell over Spanish cities and candles burned low in royal halls, the silver continued its journey, flowing outward, slipping away. And with it, Spain's future began to grow uncertain. By the middle of the 16th century, Spain stood higher than any power before it. Its territories stretched across continents. Its ships crossed every major ocean. Its name carried weight in courts, ports and marketplaces around the world. At the center of this vast domain stood one man, Charles V. He was not only King of Spain, but also Holy Roman Emperor. His lands extended across Spain, the Americas, parts of Italy, the Low Countries, and Central Europe. It was said that the sun never set on his empire. For the first time in history, a single ruler governed territories so distant they could not be seen on a single map. Charles V ruled during an age of tension. Europe was changing. The Protestant Reformation challenged religious unity. Wars erupted between Catholic and Protestant states. The Ottoman Empire pressed against Europe's borders. Spain stood at the center of these struggles. Silver from the Americas financed armies. Spanish soldiers marched across Europe, their presence felt in distant lands. Yet governing such a vast empire was exhausting. Decisions took months to travel. Rebellions flared far from the royal court. The burden of constant war weighed heavily on the crown. In 1556, Charles V made a rare decision. He stepped down. He divided his empire, passing Spain and its overseas territories to his son. His name was Philip II. Philip II ruled carefully. Unlike his father, he rarely traveled. Instead, he governed from Spain, from a fixed center. He chose Madrid as the heart of the empire. From there, paper replaced movement. Letters, reports, maps, endless documents flowed into the royal court. Philip believed order could hold the empire together. Faith was central to his rule. Spain saw itself as the defender of Catholicism. Churches rose. Missions expanded. The Inquisition enforced religious unity within Spain and its territories. At its peak, the Spanish Empire appeared disciplined, powerful, and unshakable. But maintaining control required constant effort. The empire faced challenges on every horizon. In the Netherlands, Spanish rule met resistance. Long wars drained resources and attention. At sea, England and other rivals challenged Spain's dominance. In 1588, Philip II launched the famous Spanish Armada, a vast fleet meant to secure control over the seas. The outcome was unexpected. Storms, miscommunication, and strong resistance led to failure. Spain did not collapse, but something shifted. The empire was no longer untouchable. And yet, this was still Spain's golden moment. Art flourished. Painters like El Greco created works filled with light and shadow. Writers explored honor, duty, and illusion. The Spanish language spread across continents, carried by administration, faith, and trade. Cities expanded. Universities grew. Ideas moved slowly through halls and plazas. The empire was vast, complex, and deeply human. Power and faith, wealth and strain, order and uncertainty, all existed at once. At its height, Spain appeared eternal. But empires, like oceans, shift quietly. What looks stable often hides slow change beneath the surface. The silver still arrived. The ships still sailed. The banners still flew. Yet the costs of empire were growing heavier. Spain had reached the summit, and beyond the summit, only one direction remained. As night settled over Madrid and candles flickered beside maps of the world, the empire stood still for a moment. unaware that its long descent had already begun. At first, there was no single moment that signaled change. No announcement, no collapse, no sudden silence in the ports. The empire still moved. Ships crossed the Atlantic. Silver still arrived in Seville. Royal banners still flew over distant lands. To most observers, Spain still looked strong. But strength, when stretched too far, begins to thin. The greatest burden was war. Spain fought almost constantly. In the Netherlands, decades of rebellion drained men, money, and attention. Armies marched, cities were besieged, and victories rarely lasted. In the Mediterranean, Spain defended its coasts against Ottoman expansion and piracy. In the Atlantic, English and Dutch ships challenged Spanish fleets, harassing trade routes and treasure convoys. Each war seemed necessary. Each demanded resources. Together, they became overwhelming. Silver was meant to solve everything, but silver does not multiply itself. Spain relied on it instead of building strong domestic industries. Textiles were imported. Weapons were purchased abroad. Even basic goods often came from other European states. Silver entered Spain and quickly left it. Much of it flowed to bankers in Genoa, merchants in Antwerp, and suppliers across Europe. To bridge the gaps, the crown borrowed, again and again. Spain declared bankruptcy multiple times in the 16th and 17th centuries. These bankruptcies did not end the empire, but they revealed a dangerous truth. Spain was spending the future to maintain the present. Inflation continued to shape daily life. Prices remained high. Wages struggled to keep pace. For farmers, taxes grew heavier. For artisans, competition from foreign goods increased. For ordinary families, life became narrower. The empire's wealth was visible in palaces and cathedrals, but less so in kitchens and fields. This imbalance created quiet tension, not rebellion, but fatigue. Leadership also changed. After Philip II, the kings of Spain inherited an empire larger than their experience. Power shifted away from the monarch toward royal favorites, the validos. These men governed in the king's name, often prioritizing short-term stability over long-term reform. Corruption did not explode. It spread softly. Through offices, permits, and exemptions. Administration became slower. Decisions delayed. Opportunities missed. Spain was no longer shaping events. It was responding to them. Beyond Spain, the world was accelerating. The Dutch Republic built efficient trade networks and powerful financial institutions. England invested in naval strength, commerce, and colonial expansion. France grew in population, centralization, and military organization. These states adapted. Spain remained attached to an older model of empire, one built on extraction, faith, and inherited authority. The world did not stop for Spain. It moved forward. In the Americas, distance weakened control. Local officials gained autonomy. Smuggling became common. Silver was diverted. Rules bent quietly. Spain still ruled on paper, but in practice, authority was uneven. The empire stretched wide, but its grip loosened. And so, without a fall, without a single defeat, Spain entered a long transition, from dominance to endurance, from expansion to maintenance. The cracks were not dramatic. They were structural, economic, administrative, the kind of cracks that take generations to widen. As evening settled over Madrid and candles burned low beside aging maps, Spain continued forward, still powerful, still vast, but no longer untouched by time. By the 17th century, the world had changed. Spain remained vast, with territories stretching across oceans, but other nations were growing stronger. England, the Netherlands, and France were no longer distant observers. They were active players. Trade, technology, and naval power shifted the balance of influence in ways Spain had once controlled alone. The Atlantic became busier. Dutch ships crossed routes once dominated by Spanish fleets. English merchants established new colonies. French traders reached the Caribbean and North America. Spain still claimed the lands. It still ruled its viceroyalties. But control was no longer absolute. Local officials, settlers, and rival powers constantly tested the empire's limits. In the Americas, mining continued. Cities grew. Silver still flowed. But new patterns were emerging. Smuggling networks, local uprisings, and the distance between crown and colony made enforcement more challenging. The empire had to adapt, and it did so slowly. Within Spain, life changed too. The economy struggled under rising costs, foreign debt, and inflation. Populations in rural areas declined as younger generations moved to towns or abroad. Cultural life continued. Artists and writers persisted. The Spanish Golden Age of literature and painting produced figures such as Lope de Vega and Velázquez. Even as political power waned, Spain's culture remained influential. Ideas, music, and literature spread slowly through Europe and the Americas. On the seas, Spain still maintained fleets, but maritime dominance was slipping. The English navy grew stronger, proving capable of challenging Spanish treasure fleets. The Dutch East India Company and other trading powers expanded influence in Asia. Spain's empire no longer set the pace of the world. It was one of several powers, still vast, still important, but no longer unmatched. By the mid-17th century, Spain had become a story of endurance, not collapse, not conquest, but careful preservation. Administrators balanced vast territories. Viceroys governed in distant lands. Churches, cities, and schools maintained the fabric of empire. Yet everywhere the signs were subtle. Stretching resources, slower decisions, and quiet challenges to authority. The world had moved on, and Spain moved with it, but no longer ahead of it. This was the slow, quiet phase of a great empire. Spain remained powerful, its name recognized across oceans, but it was no longer the only center of influence. Other nations were rising, trade networks growing, and global patterns shifting. The empire that had once seemed eternal was now one power among many. And so Spain endured. Vast, complex, and still influential, but forever changed. The Golden Age had passed, and the empire now faced centuries of careful management, gradual adaptation, and quiet survival. By the late 17th century, Spain's empire had become a delicate balance. Its territories were vast, but managing them had become increasingly difficult. The oceans, once pathways of power, were now routes of challenge and competition. England, the Netherlands, and France were no longer distant rivals. They competed for trade, influence, and colonies with skill and persistence. Spain still held lands across the Americas, Asia, and Europe, but the crown's authority weakened with each passing year. Internally, the empire faced strains. Royal finances remained fragile. Silver continued to arrive from the New World, but economic dependence created vulnerability. Inflation persisted, and debt grew heavier. Borrowing became routine, while investments in industry and infrastructure lagged behind. Agriculture struggled to sustain growing populations. Urban centers expanded slowly, yet poverty and hardship were present in both countryside and city. The empire, once ambitious and expanding, had become a guardian of what it already controlled. Politically, Spain faced challenges as well. Leadership was less centralized than before. Royal favorites and councils often guided decisions, sometimes more effectively than monarchs themselves. Meanwhile, local officials in the Americas exercised greater independence. Communication was slow, enforcement uneven. At sea, Spain's naval supremacy waned. Piracy, privateers, and the growing strength of other nations reduced Spain's ability to protect treasure fleets. Maritime dominance, once unquestioned, became contested. Yet culture continued to flourish. Spanish literature, art, and music remained influential across Europe and the colonies. Universities continued to teach, churches guided moral life, and traditions endured. Even in decline, Spain maintained its identity. Its people, language, and faith connected lands separated by thousands of miles of ocean. The empire's story was now one of endurance, not of conquest, not of glory, but of persistence in the face of change. By the 18th century, Spain had begun to lose some territories. Portugal, its former ally, retained independence. The Netherlands and England claimed parts of the Americas. France expanded influence in the Caribbean. These changes were gradual. Spain did not fall suddenly. It declined slowly, like a tide retreating from the shore. The empire that had once seemed endless now required careful stewardship to maintain what remained. Yet even in quiet decline, Spain's legacy endured. Language, culture, and law traveled across oceans. Cities founded centuries earlier remained centers of trade and governance. The empire's history was not only about power, it was about connection, innovation, and human ambition. Silver, ships, and conquests had reshaped the world. The influence of Spain, even in decline, was felt far beyond its borders. And so, the Spanish Empire entered its final centuries not with collapse, but with careful preservation. It became a story of adaptation, resilience, and human complexity. The Golden Age had passed. The silver fleets sailed more slowly. The world had moved on. But Spain remained, vast, rich in history, and forever imprinted on the map of human civilization. As the centuries passed, the Spanish Empire slowly faded from the center of global power. Borders shifted. Colonies changed hands. Other nations rose in influence. Yet, Spain's presence did not disappear. Its legacy endured in ways quieter, but no less profound. Across the Americas, the Spanish language became a thread that wove together communities from Mexico to Peru, from the Caribbean to the southern tip of Chile. Cities founded centuries earlier remained vibrant, their streets echoing with the footsteps of generations. Churches, schools, and universities brought knowledge, faith, and culture to distant lands. Even in places far from Spain, its influence could be felt in laws, traditions, and the rhythm of daily life. Art and literature, born during Spain's golden age, continued to inspire. Paintings by El Greco and Velázquez hung in palaces and galleries. Writings of Cervantes traveled across the world, their stories still read centuries later. Music, too, carried Spanish traditions to new generations, blending with local culture to create something enduring and entirely human. Spain's influence was not only cultural. Ideas of governance, administration, and law traveled across oceans, shaping societies in ways subtle yet lasting. The lessons of the empire, its strengths and its failures, became part of history itself, a story of ambition, of exploration, of wealth and challenge, and of the human desire to reach beyond what is known. The empire's silver and gold may have faded, but the connections it forged remained. Trade routes, cities, languages, faith, and knowledge continued to shape the world. Even as Spain moved into quieter centuries, its past echoed in every corner of the globe it had once touched. And so we end this story, not with collapse, not with defeat, but with reflection. The Spanish Empire was vast, complex, and human. It rose with ambition. It expanded with courage. It endured through challenge. And it left behind a legacy that is still visible today, in language, culture, and history. The sun continues to rise over cities, mountains, and oceans. The silver rivers have long ceased to flow, but the stories remain. And as you drift toward sleep, remember, history is not only about power or conquest or wealth. It is about people, their choices, their connections, and the legacies that quietly endure across time.